Don't give that monk the robe. That monk's a terrible monk. You're allowed to say that. That's fine. Buddhist Books Podcast, episode 138, Tipiṭaka, part 74, in which I will recite Pācittiya 79 and maybe 80. We'll see where it goes from there. If this is your first time seeing me, do go ahead and click right up there. That will take you to the Tipiṭaka playlist. Better to start with episode 1. That, of course, is for those watching me on YouTube. If you're listening to my voice and not seeing my face, then feel free to keep listening. Or you can start with episode 1 of the podcast called Tipiṭaka, T-I-P-I-T-A-K-A. Our special guest today is Mahavir, or Mahavira. He looks like he would be Lord Buddha, or a form of Lord Buddha, but he is actually part of an ecumenical exchange program. As you longtime watchers of this program know, that occasionally we have special guests from other religions, you might say. Mahavir is credited as being the founder of modern Jainism, and when I say modern, I mean for the past 2,600 years or so. He is the last of the 24 Tirthankaras, which means religious fords, meaning the way to get from one side of the river to the other. Fans of the Heart Sutra will be familiar with the concept of the other shore, gone to the other shore. But there were Tirthankaras before him, like Parshvanath and others, of course. So, if you'd like to learn a bit more about Mahavir and Jainism, there was a special 25-episode period in which we examined the Jain Sutras. That playlist is right here. Again, that's for the people on YouTube. The people on the podcast can find that in earlier episodes of Edward Reed's Buddhist Books Podcast. The one that starts with the one called Jain Sutras. And then from there it's Jain Sutras Part 2, Part 3, up to Part 25. Anyway, so how is everybody? I'm going to get right to it today. No special personal stories or anything, only to say that we are getting back to the basics with some old school. I mean, it's kind of, I was thinking about it, it's kind of a misnomer to say that we're specifically reading Theravadan Buddhism, because the Tipiṭaka, or the Tipiṭaka, the three baskets of the original teachings of Lord Buddha, are foundational to Mahayana and to Vajrayana, and they kind of represent the totality of Theravada. In a similar way that, I mean, I'm always making these comparisons, and it's a fuzzy comparison at best, but the Tanakh in Judaism is the foundation for Islam, as well as Christianity, as well as, all the different forms of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So this is sort of the equivalent of that in all of the various forms of Buddhism, from Zen to Vajrayana to whatever, whenever. So we're getting back to the basics of whatever your preferred form of Buddhism is. And if you happen to find yourself in a form of Buddhism or in a temple where you're kind of focusing primarily on calling on the Dharma protectors to defend you against the enemies of your particular sect who are magically draining you of finances and spreading rumors about the leader's misadventures online, then this one is especially for you. You might feel personally called to get back to the basics. For me, I don't hail from any such temple in Buddhism anyway. But I can relate with the folks who might find themselves in a situation like that, and I want to get back to the basics for my own reasons. But I thought I'd share it with you in the form of this podcast. So that's what's going on here. Now that, of course, is for the people who aren't already familiar with this podcast, but who decided not to take my advice, to continue to listen to this episode rather than start at the beginning of Tipiṭaka. It's okay. I mean, it's your freedom to do so. So we'll be starting with Expiation, Pācittiya 79. At one time, the Enlightened One, the Lord, was staying at Savatthi in the Jeta Grove in Anathapindika's monastery. Now, at that time, the group of 6 monks, having indulged in bad habits, protested when a (formal) act was being carried out against each one. Now, at that time, the order came to be convened on some business or other. The group of 6 monks, making robes, gave their consent to one. Then the order saying, quote, "Your Reverences, this monk of the 6-fold group is come alone. Come, let us carry out a (formal) act against him." End quote. Carried out a (formal) act against him. Then that monk approached the group of 6 monks. The group of 6 monks spoke thus to that monk, quote, "What did the order do, your reverence?" End quote. Quote, "The order carried out a (formal) act against me, your reverences." End quote. Quote, "Your reverence, we did not give the consent for this, that it would carry out a (formal) act against you. If we had known that it would carry out a (formal) act against you, we should not have given the consent." End quote. Who are you 6 monks to give consent to anybody to have a formal act against one of the 6 monks for naughty business that you all got up to? All right. "Those who were modest monks, spread it about, saying, quote, how can the group of 6 monks, having given their consent for legitimate (formal) acts, afterwards engage in criticism?" End quote. A little confused, but we'll just keep reading. Quote, "Is it true, as is said, that you monks, having given your (consent for legitimate (formal) acts, afterwards engage in criticism?" End quote. Quote, "It is true, Lord." End quote. The Enlightened One, the Lord, rebuked them, saying, quote, "How can you foolish men, having given your (consent), afterwards engage in criticism? It is not foolish men, for pleasing those who are not (yet) pleased, And thus, monks, this rule of training should be set forth. Whatever monk, having given his (consent for legitimate (formal) acts, should afterwards engage in criticism, there is an offense of expiation. Whatever means 3 dots. Monk means 3 dots. Legitimate, parentheses formal, close parentheses act, means a parentheses formal, close parentheses act for which leave ought to be asked, a parentheses formal, close parentheses act at which a motion is put, a parentheses formal, close parentheses act at which a motion is put and followed by 1 proclamation, a parentheses formal, close parentheses act at which a motion is put and is followed by 3 proclamations, carried out according to rule, according to discipline, according to the teacher's instruction. This is called a legitimate parentheses formal, close parentheses act. Having given parentheses his, close parentheses consent, if he criticizes, there is an offense of expiation. So you do give consent? All right. If he thinks that it is a legally valid act when it is a legally valid act, parentheses and close parentheses, having given parentheses his, close parentheses consent, criticizes, there is an offense of expiation. If he is in doubt as to whether it is a legally valid act, 3 dots, offense of wrongdoing. If he thinks that it is not a legally valid act when it is a legally valid act, 3 dots, no offense. If he thinks that it is a legally valid act when it is not a legally valid act, there is an offense of wrongdoing. If he is in doubt as to whether it is not a legally valid act, there is an offense of wrongdoing. If he thinks that it is not a legally valid act when it is not a legally valid act, there is no offense. There is no offense if he criticizes, knowing, quote, the parentheses formal, close parentheses act was carried out according to what is not the rule, or by an incomplete assembly, or against one not suitable for a parentheses formal, close parentheses act, end quote, if he is mad, if he is the first wrongdoer. The 9th, meaning the 79th. All right. Next, expiation. Pācittiya. LXXX. Different from regular XXX. That's, of course, 30. What were you thinking? At one time, the enlightened one, the Lord, was staying at Savatthi in the Jeta Grove in Anathapindika's monastery. Now at that time the order came to be convened on some business or other. The group of 6 monks making robes gave parentheses their, close parentheses, consent to 1. Then the order, thinking, quote, we will carry out that parentheses formal, close parentheses act for the sake of which we were convened, end quote, set aside the motion. Then that monk, thinking, quote, even thus do they carry out a parentheses formal, close parentheses act against each one. Against whom do you carry out the parentheses formal, close parentheses act, end quote. Not having given consent, rising up from his seat, departed. Those who were modest monks, 3 dots, spread it about, saying, quote, how can this monk, when the order is engaged in decisive talk, not having given the consent, rising up from his seat, depart, end quote, 3 dots, quote, is it true, as is said, that you, monk, when the order was engaged in decisive talk, not having given the consent, rising up from your seat, departed, end quote, quote, it is true, Lord, end quote. The enlightened one, the Lord, rebuked him, saying, quote, how can you, foolish man, when the order is engaged in decisive talk, not having given the consent, rising up from your seat, depart? It is not, foolish man, for pleasing those who are not, parentheses yet, close parentheses, pleased, 3 dots. And thus, monks, this rule of training should be set forth. Whatever monk, when the order is engaged in decisive talk, not having given the consent, rising up from his seat, should depart, there is an offense of expiation. End quote. Whatever means 3 dots. Monk means 3 dots. When the order is engaged in decisive talk means a matter is announced, parentheses, but, and parentheses, not decided, or a motion is set aside, or a resolution is unfinished. Not having given the consent, rising up from his seat should depart means, if he goes away thinking, quote, why should it not carry out this, parentheses, formal, close parentheses, act, parentheses, although, close parentheses, it may be quashed, parentheses, although, close parentheses, it may be incomplete, end quote. There is an offense of wrongdoing. In leaving, parentheses, the space of, close parentheses, a reach of the hand from the assembly, there is an offense of wrongdoing. When he is left, there is an offense of expiation. If he thinks that it is a legally valid act when it is a legally valid act, parentheses, and, close parentheses, not having given the consent, rising up from his seat departs, there is an offense of expiation. If he is in doubt as to whether it is a legally valid act, 3 dots, offense of wrongdoing. If he thinks that it is not a legally valid act when it is a legally valid act, 3 dots, no offense. If he thinks that it is a legally valid act when it is not a legally valid act, there is an offense of wrongdoing. If he is in doubt as to whether it is not a legally valid act, there is an offense of wrongdoing. If he thinks that it is not a legally valid act when it is not a legally valid act, there is no offense. There is no offense if he goes away thinking, quote, there will come to be quarrel or dispute or strife or contention for the order, end quote. If he goes away thinking, quote, there will come to be schism in the order or dissension in the order. If he goes away thinking, quote, he will carry out the parentheses formal, close parentheses, act according to what is not rule, or by an incomplete congregation, or against one not suitable for a parentheses formal, close parentheses, act, end quote. If being ill, he goes away. If he goes away because there is something to be done for one who is ill. If he goes away to relieve himself, or Ukarena va pasavena va pilito gakchati. So next time you need to use the washroom, you can say those Pali words and no one will understand you. Anyway, if anxious not to find fault with the parentheses formal, close parentheses, act, he goes away thinking, quote, I will come back again, end quote. If he is mad, if he is the first wrongdoer. The 10th, meaning the 80th. All right. So we started out with rules like don't kill, basic things, don't steal, no sex, and no pretending to be enlightened when you're not. The big 4. Then we had the 13, the pretty big 13, right? Then we had a couple that were, depended on the situation. Then we had some expiation, forfeiture. And then now we have the expiation rules. And so on the level of expiation rules, we have rules specifically governing the meetings about the discussion of the enforcing of rules. All right. That seems pretty reasonable. If the monk thinks that something isn't being done correctly with the meeting, he's free to get up and walk away, kind of in protest. But if everything's legitimate, if it's a complete congregation and the thing they're discussing should be discussed, and everything is valid and every consent that needs to be given has been given, you're not allowed to get up and walk out. All right. Fair enough. Isn't there a key? There's no key at the end of this one. Maybe. Wow. All right. I was expecting a key. Usually when we get to the every 10, when we got to 60, we got to 70, there was a key to remember the previous 10. So this one there isn't. There's a total of 93 of these expiation rules, so perhaps the last 2 groups are not groups of 10. Obviously, one of them is going to be a group of 13, but maybe one of them's 11 and the other one is 12 or something like that. Certainly took me by surprise. Let's read one more. Expiation, Pācittiya 81, or LXXXI. At one time, the Enlightened One, the Lord, was staying at Rajagaha. You know who else was staying at Rajagaha at around this time? All right. In the bamboo grove at the squirrel's feeding place. Now, at that time, the Venerable Daba the Malian assigned lodgings to the order and distributed meals. And the Venerable One's robe became worn thin. Now, at that time, one robe accrued to the order. Then the order gave this robe to the Venerable Daba the Malian. The group of 6 monks looked down upon, criticized, spread it about, saying, quote, "The monks are appropriating a benefit belonging to the order according to acquaintanceship." Acquaintanceship. There's a word that needs to be reintroduced into common speech. End quote. Those who were modest monks, 3 dots, spread it about, saying, quote, "How can this group of 6 monks, having given away a robe by means of a complete order, afterwards engage in criticism?" End quote. 3 dots. Quote, "Is it true, as is said, that you monks, having given away a robe, 3 dots, afterwards engaged in criticism?" End quote. Quote, "It is true, Lord." End quote. The Enlightened One, the Lord, rebuked them, saying, quote, "How can you, foolish men, having given away a robe, 3 dots, afterwards engage in criticism? It is not, foolish men, for pleasing those who are not, parentheses yet, close parentheses, pleased, 3 dots. And thus, monks, this rule of training should be set forth. Whatever monk, having given away a robe by means of a complete order, should afterwards engage in criticism, saying, quote, "The monks are appropriating a benefit belonging to the order according to acquaintanceship," end quote, "there is an offense of expiation," end quote. Like favoritism. Not quite nepotism, because Daba the Malian's not anybody's kid. I mean, he's somebody's kid, but he's not like Daba, Buddha's nephew, you know what I mean? Whatever means 3 dots. Monk means 3 dots. Complete order means belonging to the same communion, staying within the same boundary. A robe means any one robe of the 6 parentheses kinds of close parentheses robes, parentheses including close parentheses, the least one fit for assignment. According to acquaintanceship means according to friendship, according to comradeship, according to intimacy, according to one has the same preceptor, according to one has the same teacher. Belonging to the order means it comes to be given to the order, handed over to, parentheses, it, close parentheses. A benefit means the requisites of robes, alms food, lodgings, medicines for the sick, and even a lump of chonam, ooh, and a toothpick, and unwoven thread. Should afterwards engage in criticism means if he criticizes when a robe is given to one who is ordained, parentheses, and, close parentheses, agreed upon by the order as a signer of lodgings, or as distributor of meals, or as a portioner of kanji, or as a portioner of fruit, or as a portioner of solid food, or as disposer of trifles, there is an offense of expiation. If he thinks that it is a legally valid act when it is a legally valid act, parentheses and, close parentheses, criticizes when a robe is given, there is an offense of expiation. If he is in doubt as to whether it is a legally valid act, 3 dots. If he thinks that it is not a legally valid act when it is a legally valid act, 3 dots, offense of expiation. If he criticizes when another requisite is given, there is an offense of wrongdoing. wrongdoing. If he criticizes when a robe or another requisite is given to one ordained, parentheses, but, close parentheses, not agreed upon by the order as a signer of lodgings, three dots, as disposer of trifles, there is an offensive wrongdoing. So this is a Daba the Malian rule. If you complain when Daba the Malian gets something, then it's expiation. It's a wrongdoing if it's anyone else, if I'm understanding this correctly. I mean, the person assigned as a portioner of things, if something is given to that person and you say, that's favoritism, it's expiation. If you say it's given to Monk Larry and it's like, they like Monk Larry, so they gave it to Monk Larry, it's wrongdoing. Right? I think I'm understanding that correctly. And if it's not agreed upon by the order. Okay. So you shouldn't criticize, like, ever. So if it's just sort of given, like, hey, here's a robe, don't criticize. If everybody agrees, including you, to give that to someone, then it's expiation. All right. If he criticizes when a robe or another requisite is given to one who is not ordained, parentheses, whether, close parentheses, agreed upon or not agreed upon by the order as a signer of lodgings, three dots, as disposer of trifles, there is an offensive wrongdoing. If he thinks that it is a legally valid act when it is not a legally valid act, there is an offensive wrongdoing. If he is in doubt as to whether it is not a legally valid act, there is an offensive wrongdoing. If he thinks that it is not a legally valid act when it is not a legally valid act, there is no offense. So perhaps if a monk already has the maximum number of robes, I think it was 3, right? Or during certain periods of time, he's allowed to have 4 or something like that. In other words, if there's a reason why that robe shouldn't be given to that monk, then you can complain. If it's not legally valid for that robe to be given to that monk, then you can complain. But if it's fine, if the monk has, like in the case of Daba the Malian, he has one robe and it's being worn thin, they gave him the robe, everybody actually agreed, they had a meeting about it and decided to give him the robe, don't complain. All right. There is no offense if he criticizes, saying, apostrophe, what is the use of giving to one acting by nature from desire, from hatred, from confusion, from fear? For desire, for having received it, he will ruin it. He will not look after it properly. And apostrophe. So you're allowed to say that. All right. That's different from saying it's favoritism that they gave it to him. Saying, don't give that monk the robe. That monk's a terrible monk. You're allowed to say that. That's fine. All right. If he is mad, if he is the first wrongdoer, the 11th, meaning the 81st of the Pācittiya in the Tipiṭaka of the Vinaya Piṭaka, or the Vinaya Piṭaka of the Tipiṭaka, the first of the 3 baskets, the rules basket. Did you have fun? I know I did. Okay, so that's the reading for today. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Comment below. And we will continue next time with Pācittiya 82. And a special thanks to Mahavir for being present for this. And again, do check out if you haven't already. All right. To the north and to the south, to the east and to the west, to the spirits of light among us and to the spirits below, we send out our reverent love and compassion. May all beings be happy. May all beings be serene. May all beings be in peace. Until next time.